In the previous episode of GTCEFU I have obtained fusion, and now my goal was to get to ultimate voltage and obtain the wetware circuits. First, however, I would need the crystal circuits. These required crystal chips which were extremely easy except for a single comedically hard step which required either chemistry or more fusion for europium. Luckily I remembered what pack I was playing and noticed that europium had EMC, meaning I only needed one piece of it. However, it required more heat than my fusion reactor at the time could handle, which was actually a simple fix as all it required was for me to put more energy hatches on it, and now I had the europium I needed. However, I had to stick it into a macerator as only the dust had EMC value, and it could only be turned into europium in a blast furnace, which literally did not matter as I now had europium regardless. And after I had obtained the europium, the Mk1 fusion reactor was sentenced to produce helium plasma for the rest of its life. Then I started to put my eyes on the rotary hearth furnace, the hysterically large multi-block that would be a blast furnace with no added benefit other than being funny. And after a little bit of recipe and coding I was able to obtain the controller block for it. However, there was a slight problem. The construction of the multi-block required a lot of resources that I did not have sufficient quantities of. As such, I would proceed to create a giant array of electric blast furnaces, all utilizing state-of-the-art HSSG coils. I instantly got trolled as the very first thing I tried to put into the blast furnaces required coils one tier higher than HSSG, leading to me having to replace all the coils. First I automated this fancy-sounding alloy, and then I automated tantalum carbide as it was necessary in the construction of the rotary hearth furnace. I don't feel like describing everything that I automated, so here is a drawer wall showing it. I also think that the EBF wall looks cool, so here it is in full display. After that I upgraded the trinium line by replacing the centrifuge with a stronger centrifuge. I was basically swimming in resources at this point, but instead of putting them towards the rotary hearth furnace I literally forgot about it. Also, one day I would need to build the Naquadria processing line for Naquadria. That day is not this specific minute, but I still started collecting byproducts of trinium for when I plan to build it. With my newfound trinium I have assembled the trinium coils, which was quite cool, I suppose. I used these coils to smelt this fancy-sounding alloy that enabled me to have cheaper superconductor coils, which are a major part of the fusion reactor. Yes, I was building a second fusion reactor. The reasoning behind this is that I was allegedly going to need duranium for the Mark II reactor. I never ended up finding out where I would need it, but I still started building a second fusion reactor. And unfortunately duranium did not have EMC. Also, I set up a process to automatically produce these fancy circuit boards. While waiting for all the reactor stuff to process, I have began the assembling of the crystal chip generator. It was relatively not complex, but it had very satisfying recycling in it that I enjoyed thoroughly. And here is the finished product. From there on all I had to do was a bunch of recipe and coding, and I obtained the crystal circuits. GregTech has this item called World Accelerator that increases tick speed in non-GregTech machines, and since my energy turbine was a non-GregTech machine I tried using it. The problem is that it has two modes, tile entity and everything else. I have no clue what a tile entity is, so what entailed can only be explained as utter goobery. I was brawling with this machine to find out the mode in sporadic time periods that I cannot be bothered to manually sift out, but I ended up concluding that the turbine was not a tile entity as it was faster when the world accelerator was in the everything else mode. Anyways, it was time to build the second reactor. and now I had 2 reactors. Duranium was super easy to set up as all it took was gallium and radon, which could all be obtained using EMC. This duranium would proceed to never be used in the construction of the Mk2 fusion reactor, and to this day I have no clue where it was meant to be used. And now it was time for the final boss of chemistry, sterilized growth medium. The soldering alloy of wetware circuits. One of the only 2 times complex chemistry is required in this pack, and this time I decided not to cheat it by adding a custom EMC value. Firstly, I would build a large mixer, the pre-last step, as it would just be easier to work with than a normal mixer. The next step was to make mutagen, except I would do a little goof and forget the final step of distilling, leading to me making enriched bacterial sludge instead and not noticing. Also, I would like to dedicate a moment to thank the following items for not giving me a brain aneurysm due to the presence of EMC, mincemeat, salt, calcium. But regardless, time was for the item that was the reason I procrastinated so much on assembling this thing, agar. Luckily it was very linear to make, so it was preposterously easy. I do not feel like describing how much more complicated this process was than anything else this pack has, so here it is compared to the second most complex thing I built. After the growth medium is made, it only has uses in 2 machines, in a circuit assembling machine for circuit boards, not circuits. It has FU in the name for a reason. Yes, I fell for it and put down a regular assembling machine instead at first, and in a chemical reactor where when combined with osmiridium it would create stem cells. However, osmiridium was in very scarce supply, so I just went AFK overnight and came back a gregillionaire. Now I just needed to encode the circuits, and everything went smooth until I witnessed the last circuit in the line. The wetware mainframe. This circuit is precisely the point at which shit got real. First of all, it required a tritanium frame, which required tritanium, which required a Mark II fusion reactor. Secondly, it required this ridiculously fancy sounding alloy. And thirdly, it had a recipe so large that it mentally broke me to the point of building a new assembly line that was of appropriate size. Since I now had 2 assembly lines, I could finally get rid of the manual input hatch on my old assembly line and replace it with a permanent sodium-potassium setup. This would be used to create me an industrial quantity of energy hatches, specifically ZPM energy hatches, as I was about to build a 3rd fusion reactor, this time Mark II, for tritanium. First, I needed to get the resources for the reactor. The casings were preposterously expensive, but luckily I was able to halfway cheese them by using a lot of fusion glass. However, I still needed 48 Mark II casings. It would take a whole essay to demonstrate just how expensive that stuff is, so here it is in image form. I would construct the reactor right above the first reactor, as a part of tritanium was duranium, and as such it was time for pure gaming to transpire. The biggest achievement here is how it formed first try. Anyways, the first 2 things that the fusion reactor would be used for are americium and darmstadium, as both of them had EMC and as such only needed to be made once. In order to make tritanium, I made the duranium reactor not output into a solidifier and instead into the Mark II fusion reactor, and used a fluid extractor on my comically large pile of titanium. Unfortunately, the tritanium was producing at painfully slow speeds, and I was going to need over 100 of it for the UHV circuit, as the extremely fancy alloy required tritanium coils. This has led to me having to wait for tritanium to process for several eons. This was up there with the aluminium. While waiting for tritanium, I did a minor goof by trying to overclock the duranium fusion reactor with ZPM energy hatches, only to find out the reactor's overclock independent of voltage tiers and I needed a Mark II fusion reactor instead, at which point I would have already been a bazillionaire and would have absolutely no need to speed up tritanium. But I persevered, and with enough waiting I was able to successfully get distracted and craft a tritanium turbine. This was kind of stupid, but at least I had energy now, I guess. Regardless, after even more waiting I could afford the tritanium coils. I was already 50 years old by the time that happened, just like Greg intended, but finally, I had everything I needed for the wetware mainframe. Everything passed that had been smooth sailing, except for the part where the craft was 100 seconds. That was not very funny, but that doesn't matter. I now officially am an ultra high voltage. This means that the only things left for me in this pack are forms of extreme Chinese torture that are so extreme I once more have no clue if the next part will be real. However, please do not forget to Greg and GregScribe for more gaming Greg content in a manner similar to this.